Welcome to Friday, people. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for being patient with me as I finished up the lesson. Today is Friday, March 26th, and we are discussing pedigrees today. This is really the last bit of new information that we will discuss. We do have another standard that we need to go over, but it's very, very simple. It's really basically common knowledge. So we'll basically take Monday as an opportunity to review. Friday will be our exam for the unit. We're looking at a 40-question exam, which means that in order for you all to master it, to get an 80%, I think that means you need a 36. Is my math wrong? I don't know. Somebody check my math. 4 times 2.5 is what? Oh, so my math is wrong. I don't remember, but 40 questions is not that many. And then Wednesday will obviously be a shortened day. We're just going to take that as an opportunity to track our data and reflect, and then I'll kind of talk about what I want you all to do over spring break. It won't be labor intensive. You do deserve a break, and I know we all need a break. So I expect that you all will get some time to relax and rejuvenate your bodies and your minds as we head into the final stretch. But obviously, I don't want you to forget too much over spring break. So we'll have just a little bit to do, and I'll provide some new resources to you all. Today, we're going to talk about something called the pedigree, which basically looks like a family tree. It basically is a family tree, specifically to track genetic traits. So I think you all will kind of recognize them when you see them. But we want to think about how we can, again, take information from those pedigrees, just like we were able to take information from Punnett squares. All right. And sorry, I didn't mention, but today is the 6th day of our 7th unit. So a pedigree is a diagram showing the presence or absence of a trait within a family across several generations. Typically, it's at least 3 generations. Analyzing these pedigrees allows us to do several things. Number one, we can determine if the trait is dominant or recessive. Number two, we can also determine if the trait is sex-linked. And hopefully we know what all of these terms mean at this point, since we've been talking about them for a week now. And then lastly, we can actually look at these pedigrees and determine individuals' genotypes and their phenotypes. One thing I want to caution you all about here is to get out of the habit of thinking, if you are in the habit, I don't know if you are, but get out of the habit of thinking that having a trait is a bad thing. Sometimes the trait we're talking about is literally just hair texture or hair color. It's not a bad thing. Sometimes the trait we're talking about might be a disorder of some kind, but it's not always going to be a bad thing. So please keep that in mind. When we say having a trait, all we're saying is that you have, you're being affected by that trait. You have whatever it is we're talking about. Also, get out of the habit of thinking, if you are in the habit, that having a trait is the same thing as having an allele. And I'll talk about what exactly I mean by that. This came up in my last class, and I thought it was a great question one of my students asked. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so these pedigrees are kind of cool to look at, and they're pretty useful to analyze. So when we're looking at them, these are the typical symbols that we use. Now, you probably in this class are not going to see anything about deceased individuals. You won't see the carrier symbol for the most part, but we do need to be familiar with males are squares. So you should probably write that down. We represent males with squares. we represent females with circles. Individuals who have mated, meaning individuals who have offspring together, are represented by a horizontal line that connects them, that directly connects them. Individuals who are siblings have kind of right angles coming out of them. So a vertical line and then a horizontal line that connects them. So it's kind of an indirect connection. So I want to be clear about that. Obviously, we don't want to think about siblings mating. That's when we think about humans, that's pretty much frowned upon. But this doesn't also always have to be humans. We could be talking about any animal species, any sexually reproducing species with pedigrees. So males are squares, females are circles. Individuals who do have the trait, meaning who are affected by the trait, will be shaded in. And individuals who are not affected by the trait will appear to be unshaded. They'll be hollow. Okay. Any questions about this so far? I'll leave it up for a little bit longer. Okay. All right. So we are going to introduce some steps here. You should be writing things down, but I know you guys always do. So the first thing you need to do is label the generations and individuals within that generation. So we use Roman numerals to represent generations, and then we use cardinal numbers to represent the individuals. So a Roman numeral is like I for 1, I for 2, I for 3, IV for 4. Fun facts. Is anybody a big Beyonce fan? Wow. Okay. Interesting. Is that a generational divide or what? Okay, well, maybe you're not a fan, but does anybody know Beyonce's oldest daughter's name?
Yeah.
It's Blue Ivy, right?
Yeah.
If you know anything about Beyonce or Jay-Z, you know that they love what number? What is their favorite number? It's just 4. I'm pretty sure it's just 4. Because I think Beyonce's birthday is like September 4th, and Jay-Z's is December 4th, and he had an album called 444, blah, blah, blah. They love this number 4. Why did they name their daughter Blue Ivy? Because IV is the Roman numeral for 4. That's true, though. I'm pretty sure that's actually why they did that. Okay, anyway, we use Roman numerals for the generations, and we use cardinal numbers for the individuals. You number people from left to right, or number individuals, I should say, from left to right, and you start at 1 for each generation. So you don't continue from one generation to the next. It's not 1, 2, then next generation 3, 4, 5, then next generation 6, 7, 8, 9. You start over with each generation. The top generation will always be generation 1. Then under that will be generation 2. Then under that is 3, so on and so forth. Okay. So let's take a look at this pedigree. First, we need to label our generations. So I'm going to literally put the Roman numeral 1 at the top. And then under that, I'm going to put 2, 3, 4 in Roman numerals. Then I'm going to label my individuals. So I'm going left to right, and I'm restarting with every single generation. So that very first shaded circle at the top is number 1, and then the square to the right of it is number 2. Then I restart for generation number 2, and that first square that's unshaded in generation 2 is again number 1. And then I go 2, 3, 4. Then I go to generation 3 and I restart again. The shaded square in generation 3 is number 1 again, and then finish it off 1, 2, 3, 4 at the bottom. Okay. Now let's answer some questions. So can anyone tell me at least one individual who is affected by this trait? Who is affected by this trait? I guess I kind of skipped something I should have said. So we can identify individuals, for example, by using the Roman numeral for their generation. So in this case, I, and then we use their number. So generation I, number 1, that refers to the very first, good, Dijon, thank you. That refers to the very first individual. Then we've got II2 and II4. Thank you, Dijon. Anybody else? Who else is affected by this? IV3 and IV4, good. And then, of course, we've got III1 and III2. So this is how we actually refer to a specific individual. Okay. We also want to be aware of some of the relationships between them. So can anyone tell me the relationship between individual I2 and individual II4? What is their relationship? Excellent. They are father and son. Good. And we're looking at the fact that individual I2 is a male. Individual I2 is a male. Then individual II4 is directly under that person and is that person's son. So they are father and son. Good job. Okay, let's try another one. What about individual II2 and II4? What is their relationship?
They're the same shape.
They're not the same shape. So II2 is a circle, II4 is a square.
Oh.
Do you see that?
Oh, yes, yes, I see it.
Good. They are siblings. What kind of siblings are they? Yeah, they're brother and sister. Specifically, II2 is a female, so she would be the sister, and then II4 is a male, so he would be the brother. Okay. What about between II2 and III3? What is their relationship? Good, good. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, JT. Yeah, they are mother and son. So II2 is the shaded circle in the second row. And III3 is the unshaded square, the only unshaded square in the third generation. So that is a male, an unaffected male. So they must be mother and son. I think there's one more. Let's see. Oh, hold on. Okay, what is the relationship between II2 and IV3? So this is a jump here. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you as well, Sally. That's correct. That's a grandmother and her grandson. Good. So we skipped a generation there. We skipped generation 3 and went directly to generation 4. Okay. So once you've labeled your individuals and you kind of have a feel for how they are related to one another and who is affected, then we want to actually determine what kind of trait the pedigree is showing. So you want to determine if the pedigree shows a dominant, recessive, or sex-linked trait. There are some specific clues that we're going to follow to make this easier, and we'll talk about those clues over the next few slides. It can also be helpful to make a key in these examples or in these problems, just to kind of help organize your thoughts, but it's not as important as when we were doing these Punnett squares. Especially if you know what kind of trait the pedigree is showing. And then from there, you should be able to determine the genotypes and the phenotypes of individuals within the pedigree. Okay. So for dominant traits, I tried to highlight the stuff that I think would be most important to write down. But of course, dominant traits are only going to affect individuals who have the dominant allele. So you could be homozygous dominant and have 2 dominant alleles, and you will be affected by dominant traits. Or you could also be heterozygous and only have 1 dominant allele, but you will still be affected by the dominant trait. So people who are homozygous recessive do not have these traits. They are not affected. So what color or how will they appear in a pedigree if they don't have it? They'll be unshaded. Good. So with these dominant traits, unshaded individuals must be homozygous recessive. If they are unshaded, they must be homozygous recessive. Keep that in mind. We can determine if a pedigree shows a dominant trait by checking and seeing if if someone in every generation has the trait. If we see that every generation has at least 1 person with the trait, that means that this is probably a dominant trait. Another way to think about this is if a person has the trait, or if an individual has the trait, then at least one of their parents also had to have had the trait. Because 2 individuals who are homozygous recessive cannot have a child with a dominant allele. It's not possible. Let me demonstrate that in my handy dandy Punnett square. Oh. So if I have 2 individuals who mate and they are both homozygous recessive, it's literally not possible for their child or any of their children to have the dominant allele. We don't see any capital letters. It's not possible. So that means that if the child does have a dominant allele, at least one of their parents also had the dominant allele. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Cool. So let's practice with the dominant trait. Oh, yeah. Every generation is affected, and everybody who has the trait has at least 1 parent with the trait. That's how you know it's a dominant trait. Okay. So for this dominant trait, A represents the dominant allele, capital A, and lowercase a represents the recessive allele. Now we want to determine the genotypes of the 4 individuals on the left. So individual I1, what is his gen? Well, first of all, is he affected or not? Individual I1, or not he, is that person, is that individual affected or not? Yes, and it's actually not a he. Well, we don't really know, but we know it's not a male. So this individual is not a male. This is an affected female. And what else can we tell about them? So if they are, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. If they are affected and this is a dominant trait, then what are their possible genotypes? Good, thank you, Abigail. So in order to be dominant, of course, you need to have one dominant allele. That means you could be heterozygous, as Abigail tells us, or you could be homozygous dominant. Either one of those genotypes will make you affected. So just by looking at that single individual, we can't tell exactly what their genotype is. It can be one of these two things. But this is what makes pedigrees so useful, because we have information about the entire family. And this is actually how medicine works. This is why you go in and your doctor will ask you for your family medical history, because information about your family members is useful to determining information about you. So we don't just look at this one individual. We should also look at this individual's parents. In this case, we don't have any information about their parents because they're in the first generation. But we can also look at their children and get information about them. So how are the children helpful to us here? What can we take from the children? Some of them are affected, and one of them is not affected. There's a circle in the middle of generation 2 who must be the daughter of that person, I1, and that person is not affected. So this is why I drew 2 Punnett squares. Let's see. Okay. Person I2, what is their genotype? Person I2. If they're unaffected. Lowercase a, lowercase a. So I'm going to use green for that person. So person I2 is a unshaded square. So that means that they do not have the dominant allele. They must be homozygous recessive, meaning lowercase a, lowercase a. So I'm going to write that, since they are the father of those 3 children, I'm going to write them on the left side of the Punnett. And as we just discussed, and as Abigail told us, the mother could be either heterozygous or homozygous dominant. So let's try both Punnett squares and see what we get. Okay. If the mother is heterozygous, This is what we end up with. And if she is homozygous dominant, that is what we end up with. What do you notice about this one on the left if she's homozygous dominant? What do you notice about her children? All of them have this trait. They will all be affected by the trait because they're all heterozygous. They all have at least one dominant allele. If they all had the trait, then it wouldn't be possible for her to have individual III because individual III is not affected. I'm sorry, II3. All of her kids that means that she has to be heterozygous. Because here you can see it's 50% not that's the only difference possible. So she has to be heterozygous. So this is why it's important to have the ability to look at both parents and children. In this case, we needed to get information about the child in order to figure out information about the mother. The fact that the child is unaffected in this case proves that it's not possible for the mother to be homozygous dominant. The mother had to have been heterozygous. All right. So this stuff can be a little tricky. It's going to take some practice. Okay, generation I or person I2. We already discussed the fact that this is what? What is that person? What'd you say? Yeah, good. Lowercase a, lowercase a. Thank you, Lisa. That person is an unaffected male. That's why they are a square that is unshaded. So they're unaffected. Okay, person II2. What about them? They are affected. And so what does that mean? Exactly. They could be homo dominant. So there are two options there. They could be heterozygous. Look at their children. They have to be heterozygous. For the same reason as the last. If they were homozygous, all of their kids would have. But this person right here, so they had to a recessive. Does this make sense? Okay. Yes, Abigail, that's true. So it is heterozygous. Now, one thing that might be confusing to you all here, we've got to remember that we get one allele from each parent. So if I am an unaffected individual and this is a dominant trait, that must mean that I'm homozygous recessive, which means that I got a recessive allele from both of my parents. Mom gave me a recessive allele, dad gave me a recessive allele. That's the only way. Okay, let's try the next one. Generation III. What do we see about that person? What did you say? Lowercase a, lowercase a. Good. Yes, because that individual is unaffected. That is the square at the very, very bottom. So what do you guys think about this? What's giving you the most trouble right now? What's hardest about this? What are you struggling with or struggling to understand? Or do you get it? Or do you not know what you don't know? How do you feel about this, Ashley? You do understand it? Okay. What about you, Sayana? You do? Okay. Good. All right. Okay, let's try another one. These are recessive traits now. So we're literally flipping it. So these traits only affect people who are homozygous recessive. Everyone else will be unaffected. So the only way to get these traits is if you have two recessive alleles. That's the only way to get these. The clue that will tell us if a pedigree is a recessive trait is if we see the trait skipping generations. So this means now it is possible to have a trait even if neither of your parents had it. So let's demonstrate that. So over here, well, I'll wait until people are done writing. All right. So over here, we've got two parents. Both of them are heterozygous. That means that if this is a recessive trait, neither of them has the trait. But take a look at this. Because they both have one recessive allele, one lowercase a, that they can pass on, it is possible for them to have a child who does have the trait. Okay, that's what's special about recessive traits. And this is actually super, super important in terms of evolution. This contributes a lot to our genetic diversity, not just as human beings, but across all forms of life. The fact that we have, number one, we reproduce sexually. Number two, we pass on two alleles, or we pass on our alleles to our children. And number three, we can hide that recessive allele so that you don't actually have the trait, but you can pass it on. That's super important for evolution. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say it's skipping a generation. It might be the case that neither of your parents has the trait, but they both were carrying the trait. They both passed it on to you. So you ended up having it. It skipped a generation. Okay. All right, let's do some more practice. So this is a recessive trait now. Again, that means that the only way to have it is if you are homozygous recessive. We're going to use the letter F in this example. F represents the dominant allele, capital F, and lowercase f represents the recessive allele. So now we want to determine the genotypes of these 4 individuals. Okay, individual I1. Individual I1. Are they affected or are they unaffected? Thank you, Lisa. Let's see if somebody at home can tell us. Are they affected or unaffected? Anybody at home know if generate or person I1? Good, thank you, Dejan. They are affected. We're looking at that very first circle, the shaded circle at the top of the pedigree. So yeah, of course, that person is affected. When we see a shaded individual, that means affected. So if they are affected by a recessive trait, what is their genotype? 2 lowercase letters. They have 2 recessive alleles. So 2 lowercase f's in this case. Thank you, Abigail. All right, generation 3-2 or generation II-2. What is that person? We're looking at this person right here. And how do you know they're heterozygous, Sally? That is correct. How do you know that they're heterozygous? They're a carrier. Good, exactly. Because we can see that they have 2 children who end up having the trait. Whatever the trait is, they end up having 2 affected children. So that means that even though they weren't affected, they're not shaded, they must have passed on the recessive allele to their children. Okay, what about person IV1? What is their genotype? Yeah, good. 2 lowercase f's because they are also affected. And then generation or person, individual, II3. What about them? In fact, I think I got this one wrong, actually. I know I got this one. Well, not wrong, but not totally correct. This could be either. We don't know exactly what this person's. Yeah, they could be. They could be heterozygous. Yeah, or they could be homozygous dominant. We don't know enough information about them. We know that they do not have a child who is affected, but we don't know if it's impossible for them to have a child who is affected. Okay, it's not like, we're only looking at 3 children here. Now, if they had 10 children and none of them were affected, then that probably means that they are homozygous dominant. But we don't know, so ignore my answer there. I tried to move too fast. It could be both. It could be heterozygous or homozygous dominant. Excuse me. All right, one more type of inheritance here, sex-linked traits. So these are traits that will primarily affect males. Remember, males are more likely to express sex-linked traits. That is because males only have 1 X chromosome, and so their chances of having a trait are 50% because they either have it on their X or they don't. Whereas a female's chances are 33% because they could be homozygous dominant, they could be heterozygous, and they can be homozygous recessive. Now, typically, we only will talk about sex-linked recessive traits, but there are some sex-linked dominant traits. I don't even think we're going to spend any time talking about those. So, So in the pedigree, the clue to determine if it's a sex-linked trait is if you are seeing far more males than females. Not just like, oh, there are 2 males who are affected and 1 female. That's not enough information to say if it's a sex-linked or not. We want to see a ratio of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 males to females, or 3 to none, as is the case here. 3 males are affected and 0 females are affected. That's an indication that we're talking about a sex-linked trait. Okay. So we see 3 males who have the trait while no females do. Okay, so for this sex-linked trait, remember, sex-linked, we use the X chromosomes, X and Y chromosomes. So X to the power of D, or X with a superscript of capital D, represents the dominant allele. X with a superscript of lowercase d represents the recessive allele. In this case, we're looking at a recessive trait. I will tell you that. Okay, I don't want to complicate this. We are looking at a recessive trait. In fact, we can tell because we see it skipping a generation. The parent generation, the great-grandparents at the very top, neither of them has the trait, but they end up having a son who does have the trait. So that's proof that this is a recessive trait. Okay, so individual I1, what is that person's genotype? Remember, we're using X's and Y's now, so that kind of complicates things. First of all, is person I1 affected or not? No, they are not affected. And because this is good, yeah, that's kind of funny. XD. Okay, so because they are not affected, that means that they do not have the recessive allele. Or, yeah, because they're a male, they don't have the recessive allele. So we see X to the capital D, Y. Good. And of course, because they are a male, they have X and Y chromosomes. Okay, what about person II1? So it's that square on the far left of generation 2. I think I messed this one up as well. Oh, no. Yeah, good. Thank you, Sally. Again, we've got an unaffected male here. So, of course, they have a capital D. They have a recessive allele, and they also have a Y. Good. Thank you, Melissa, as well. Okay, what about person II3? Are they affected or unaffected? Good. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Lisa, as well. So that is an affected male. And the only way to be affected is if you have that lowercase d. Okay, so one more person, III4. What are they? Okay, III4. Now be careful. Good, thank you, Sally. III4 is not a male. So III4 is a female. We should have 2 X chromosomes. And even though we don't know for sure, we know that that person is unaffected. So they could be a homozygous recessive female, or they could be a carrier female, a heterozygous female. But we know that if we look at their children, at her son, she must be a carrier because her son is affected. So that person is a carrier, X capital D, X lowercase d. So this is kind of tough. For the most part, this is what we need to be able to do. We need to ask ourselves these questions. I don't even think on the EOC exam they will ask you all to determine the genotype of individuals. I think they'll just ask you to, for example, look at a pedigree like this and say, what kind of trait is it? Is it recessive or is it dominant? Is it sex-linked? Is it autosomal? That's all you'll have to do. Okay, so if you're struggling with being able to identify the individuals or figure out their genotypes, that's okay, because that's kind of a little bit above the level of this class. That's kind of like an AP class task. Really what you need to be able to do is look at the pedigree and determine if it's dominant or recessive. The question you have to ask yourself to do that is the trait skipping generations? If the answer is yes, then it's a recessive trait. If the answer is no, then it's a dominant trait. The second question you need to ask yourself, is the trait affecting more men than women? And I'm sorry, I should say males than females. If the answer is yes to that, then it is sex-linked. And if the answer is no to that, then it is autosomal, which means not sex-linked. So if you can just remember to ask yourself those two questions, you'll probably be fine. I don't think we're going to push you to the level of having to identify genotypes. Any questions about any of that information? Okay. Monday, we will review. I'm going to give you one more assignment to do because we didn't have any assignments for sex-linked or multiple alleles. So I want to have some practice with that. And then Tuesday will be the exam. But so far, nothing new to do this weekend, only the 4 assignments that you've already gotten over the course of this week. There is a new exit ticket that you can go ahead and knock out. Yeah. Let me know if you need anything. I will be here on mute.